kids, you know what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about Sandman. It is a #1 New York Times audio bestseller, man. Now, this is an audio drama. This isn't an audio book. It's not like you're just going to listen to a book on tape. This is a fully produced audio drama with 68 members in the cast. So breathtaking in how epic this presentation of Sandman is. It is my absolute pleasure to socially distance welcome the mastermind behind the Sandman universe to New York Comic-Con, Neil Gaiman, along with co-executive producer, adapter, director, multi-hyphenate, Dirk Maggs, composer James Hannigan, and lastly, the voice behind the Lord of Dreams himself, James McAvoy. Gentlemen, welcome to the panel.
Thanks for having us.
Pleasure. Thank you, Kevin.
Take me back to the beginning, because it's so rare that you get to meet the people who influenced you, whose work influenced your work. Where does Sandman come from?
Sandman came really from desperation, but in a good way, in that it was 1986. I was writing my first ever comic. Dave McKean was drawing it. It was called Black Orchid. And I got a phone call from Karen Berger, who was my editor, saying, look, we're really worried because we've just noticed that you and Dave McKean are doing this comic. And it's about a female character that nobody's ever heard of. And we want to try and do something to raise your profile. So would you like to do a monthly comic? And I said, sure, because monthly comic sounded amazing. And she said, what would you like to do? And I listed a bunch of things and they were all taken. And she said, what about that Sandman idea? You mentioned you wanted to do something with Sandman. And I said, oh yeah. She said, yeah, but don't do any of the Sandmans we've had before. Do a new one. And I'm like, okay, I can do that. And I had no idea, of course, if I could do that or not. But all I knew was that I'd never written a monthly comic. I'd never had to write a monthly story. I'd been a journalist. And if I was going to tell a monthly story, I needed something that could take me anywhere. And sat down, I think, with a book of quotations, looked up dreams in the book of quotations, ran into one that mentioned that sleep was the brother to death. And suddenly it was like a little door in my head opened and the light shone in. And I went, there's a family.
So amazing to sit here and listen to the secret origin of a DC secret origin, if you will. And we're going to move down the line, man. Dirk, you've known this gentleman for a long time, and you've been friends, you've worked together, but you go way back in audio drama. Is that correct? This is not your first rodeo, as they say.
I did The Adventures of Superman for BBC Radio, which was really cool because who knew BBC would allow someone to do Superman. It was me in a studio with a couple of engineers at the BBC, and BBC studios were not made for superheroes. They were made for polite cups of tea and anyone for tennis and all of that. So it was kind of, it was a wrench, but we had such fun just trying to be as visual as we could and create a world. How does Metropolis sound? What if you're by the river, what can you hear? If you're in a park, what can you hear? And by comparison, because then we did Batman, how does Gotham sound? In a park in Gotham, will birds sing? Probably not. Probably it's more like the serenade of distant sirens. But, all of this, creating worlds without pictures, and yet the pictures come in your mind. It became a sort of desperate addiction for me. And it didn't help at all to make friends with Neil Gaiman. In fact, he ruined my life, Kevin. He's kept me at it now for 28 years before we finally got to do Sandman. But we are now, I cannot tell you what a joy it is to work with Neil and to finally create the world of the dream and the dreaming and everything else with this amazing cast.
Was there ever a moment where we were writing Sandman in the very beginning and felt like this is the signature piece? You've done a bunch of things, a vast career, but Sandman is not just like a first able effort. It's landmark epic work, first time out the gate. As you're writing those initial scripts, do you know what it's going to be? Do you suspect? And be very honest, you've had 30 years.
There were probably 3 times making Sandman where I knew that I was doing something special. And the first was Sandman 8, The Sound of Her Wings. When I wrote that, and all of a sudden, I felt like I was leaving aside all of the things that I knew about how to write mainstream comics, and I was writing something that nobody had written before. Just the idea of, okay, he meets his sister and they walk around and they talk, and he's a bit depressed at the beginning of the comic and he cheers up a bit by the end, and on the way we get an idea of who he is. That felt special. Sandman 19, which is another one that's actually also, those 2 are both in the first Sandman adaptation. The Midsummer Night's Dream, it's actually the one that we end the first audio on. That felt special. That just felt like I knew that I was doing something that either was going to be brilliant or that people would point at and laugh about for the rest of time. It was either going to be this thing that was going to win awards and people were going to adore, or it was going to be full on sort of, one of those comics like Brother Power the Geek that people talk about when they just want to be funny. Right. Oh yeah, you remember Sandman 19, the Midsummer Night's Dream one? Well, at least it's not that. And I think the last probably was Sandman 50, Ramadan. Craig Russell. Writing that for Craig, I knew that I was making something that he would turn into something incredibly beautiful. And when it came back, I just looked at it and went, there are mainstream comics are not meant to be this beautiful. And that really was.
The Sound of Her Wings, I could tell you, as a matter of fact, and I think I've discussed it before, like came to me literally on my deathbed when I was having the heart attack and I was on the table and whatnot. I thought about my life. You can't help but think about your life as it flashes before your eyes. And what I fell upon that gave me great comfort, aside from singing the Degrassi Junior High theme song over and over in my head, was that moment in the book where she meets the older man and in The Sound of Her Wings, and the older man's like, what did I have? What did I get? You're here already, and what did I get? And Death says, you got what everybody gets. You got a life. That exact piece of writing, like literally gave me comfort in a time where I was like, I have a 20% chance of living right now, but you know what? You got what everyone gets. You got a life. Like, that's profoundly wonderful writing, man. So much so that it was with me the day I almost died. So kudos to you, wordsmith. And we're going to move down the line, man. In order to bring the Sandman to life, man, you have to find the voice. You have to find Morpheus. In comics, Morpheus' dialogue was always represented in almost dark, almost cosmic balloons. Instead of white balloons initially, black balloons with white writing in them, and the balloons would be shaped differently. It was always meant to infer that if you were hearing this guy, he doesn't sound like anybody you've ever heard in your life. And in order to do that, they reached out to somebody who could do it all, like an excellent performer who had to figure out what Morpheus was going to sound like, man. So they went to the All Master, they went to Professor X. James, how do you figure out what a character that's been around for 30 years and emo and goth kids have tattooed all over themselves? How do you figure out what he sounds like?
It's difficult because he is a protagonist in the sense that the audience follow him through so much of the story. but he can't just be an everyman, because he's not. He's not any man. He is his own man, and he's putting his own man back together, crucially as well. So he's still trying to figure out who he is, who he's going to be, who he used to be. He's got to be other, he's got to be outer, he's got to be alien, but he can't be Spock. He can't be emotionless, he can't be humorless. His emotion and his humor isn't reactive to the same things that you and I are, but it's got to be enough that we still connect with the guy. And at times we're confused by the guy and all that, but there are a lot of times where we do want to connect with the guy and relate to the guy as well, without making him just an everyman. So that was confusing and difficult. And ultimately, I think I said to Dirk, which part have I played that made you think, oh, that would be good? So which voice do you want me to do? And I can't remember which one you said, but you did say the gravity of somebody like Charles, and I can't remember what else we put into it, but we tried to make him distant at times, and aloof is the wrong word, but you know, like he's viewing his own life sometimes from a different room, you know what I mean? And at times he feels like he's underwater, I think. And there's something about the pace with which Neil writes and the pace with which he speaks that I think informs him. Neil had said through Dirk that he would like Morpheus to sound almost classical.
You mentioned the beautiful music, and that's an element, of course, when we go see a motion picture. Sometimes they'll clear away all the acting. You can hear the music soar. It's very present, but generally speaking, it's kind of quietly underneath, and you don't even feel it working on you. Really great score, orchestral score will work on the down low. It's not very broad and in your face. Here in the audio realm, naturally, music's going to play a big part of things and probably play a more central role than it would necessarily in a motion picture, at least a role that's going to be noticed more because there's only very few audio elements at work, score being one of them. James, how do you approach scoring the endless? How do you score a comic book that everybody's read for 30 years, for 3 decades? How do you go like, okay, you know, this is what I feel that Sandman sounds like?
Well, it's interesting what you say about this, the role of music in film. I can't remember who said it. I think it may have been George Lucas, but he sort of estimated that sound and music is 60% of the experience, something like that. But it is interesting that it's also the sort of aspect of a production that people are least aware of or least conscious of, because it's sort of affecting us subconsciously, I guess. So I don't know. I think it's probably more noticeable in its absence. You know, if you took it away, you wouldn't have as many emotional cues. But there's something like this. I mean, I think, you know, with the absence of visual cues, there's a sort of, the onus on the composer is to sort of lend atmosphere and sort of create a sort of, well, and the sound designers to create a kind of virtual set and sort of paint pictures, not necessarily always support a narrative. You know, not sort of punctuate every moment. You know, like in a sort of superhero film, you may have a kind of big setup shot. The camera pulls back and you'll hear this sweeping music, and there's a moment for the music to sort of exist by itself and make a point of some kind. But in a drama like this, it's, you know, I think the function is different in the sense that it's mostly underpinning dialogue. So I think restraint is a big factor.
In the performing arts, particularly when you're in movies and TV shows and whatnot, it's about your performance being seen as well as heard. You know, and that's a powerful tool for an actor and actress. You don't even, you know, the words can be terrible. You could still be able to rescue a performance with your expressions, with the emotion, with your emoting. Here, they take those strengths away in audio drama, and it falls squarely onto the voice to have to do all of the heavy lifting, every piece of the lifting. Is there freedom in not having to be on camera, or are you like, oh man, like I wish I could just play this with a look, I wouldn't have to say this?
I think, look, you know, you can, a performance can be helped with the visuals and all that kind of stuff. But what is performance? Performance is just a tool, with which to tell stories. And really, if the story's strong enough and the story's got enough blood in it and enough heart in it and enough veins in it and enough capillaries in it and enough fucking everything in it, then it doesn't matter what tools you have to tell that story.
One of the joys for me of what James did in his performance was, as he's already said, we'd got people to stand in and play Morpheus scene by scene, line by line for the other actors. There was a point where I wound up doing it. And because James's performance was recorded last of all, Dirk had actually cut together rough episodes and you could hear how they sounded. And nobody was Morpheus. The lines got said, but nobody actually made that character come to life. And then suddenly, I started hearing stuff from Dirk, and he'd say, you know, it's not really ready for anybody to hear yet, but I'm sending it over to you anyway. And I get to hear what James was doing. And now we had Morpheus, and everything came to life. And it was as if everything was in position, but the lights weren't on. And James came in and was Morpheus, and the lights went on. And it really is magic, and it cannot be overstated how important that is.
We've got some questions from the New York Comic-Con fans. Michael Cook, he's at Thorough Lime, L-Y-M-E. What was your favorite part of adapting the first 3 arcs? What from the remaining stories are you most looking forward to adapting?
For me, my favorite was Midsummer Night's Dream, because I love the play, I love Shakespeare, and I had fond memories of going to Regent's Park open air production in the early 90s with a friend of mine who was a comedian in the lead. And it turned out in conversation with Neil that he'd actually been inspired by the same venue and a performance a couple of years earlier. And it was a magical night. And that is a magical play. And it brings all the worlds of dream and all of that into the world of Shakespeare and into the realms of fairy. It's a wonderful episode. It was my favorite. And also we ended up probably recording about 2/3 of the whole play of Midsummer Night's Dream, so I had enough material to go underneath. So somewhere on the cutting room floor is the Sandman Repertory Company version of A Midsummer Night's Dream. Yeah. I you know what? I'm looking forward. This is going to sound so pathetic, Kevin, but I'm looking forward to doing all of it.
Neil, favorite part of adapting the first 3 arcs and the remaining stories you're looking forward to adapting?
For me, I mean, the favorite part of adapting the first 3 arcs was actually the days that I spent in the Audible UK studio with Dirk on the other side of the glass, reading all the narration, actually having to become the narrator, that weird little voice in the boxes, and occasionally going in and changing a word here or a word there if it didn't quite work, if it was written to be read and not to be spoken aloud.
Sacrilege.
It's got to happen. But I mean, for me, the joy, honestly, was knowing that we were making something that for years and years and years, I have people who love my novels, they love my short stories, they might love my television or whatever, and that people who are visually impaired, or people who are what I will call comics impaired, their brains don't do comics. Those people don't get Sandman. They get everything else. But there's this huge thing that I made that I'm so proud of and that I love, and that they cannot reach it. Right. And just feeling that we were making this thing that, yes, people who love audiobooks will get, but also that the people who are visually impaired and have not ever been able to read Sandman, that they would read Sandman, that the people who just can't do comics for whatever reason, they would be able to get Sandman as well. That for me was the most exciting thing. And I guess I kind of think of that looking at the rest of Sandman. I've been into really dusty and obscure parts of my hard disk and found all these scripts for Dirk that nobody has looked at in literally 30 years. And sent every script over to him that I could find, including things that I'd forgotten ever existed. So he has all of these Sandman scripts and everything on his disk. And mostly I look at what we've done so far and I go, okay, this is probably about 1/6 of the total thing that we're gonna make. And just looking at and going, well, we're going to make all of this is such a joy.
The Sound of Her Wings, that episode, and the scoring that was possibly my, yeah, I mean, it's just the interplay between death and dream, and it's sort of trying to convey sort of power and vulnerability of dream, but with the sort of the warmth of death. I mean, that I think was the most enjoyable part for me, sort of coming up with this bittersweet underscore.
Beautifully put. The Last Cito 8 asked this for everybody on the panel. Which Sandman character do you relate to the most? We'll start with Neil, since you're right there, sir.
Oh, Merv Pumpkinhead.
Really?
Merv Pumpkinhead got to be me whenever I was writing and just going, really? And then I'd give him, he'd get to be me and he'd get to say, this is so dumb. And then somebody would get to come in and do an elegant and brilliant put down of whatever he thought things were dumb. But, you know, at the end of the day, I think I always felt that making Sandman was a gloriously blue-collar job. You know, making Sandman, I really did. It wasn't sort of magically done in an ivory tower. It was something that the first time we did it was being done with artists and letterers and colorers and editors and deadlines that could not be missed, because if you miss the deadline and so-and-so doesn't get to color it, he doesn't get to pay his rent. So you are going to make sure that you hit your deadline so that everybody else can make their rent. And I feel that way again, working with Dirk. What I love about working with Dirk on this is it doesn't feel a magical, highfalutin ivory tower thing. It feels like we're always down there in the practicality of, what does this sound like? What is that? What kind of voice was I imagining? What kind of voice can Dirk find in his people? How are we going to cast this? How are we going to make it? And it's that, you know, and again, you as a filmmaker must know, there's the magic thing you have in your heart, and then there's a script, and then there's making it. And making it's a train set. Making it is putting up wallpaper. Making it is sweeping out and cutting down and trimming, and it is the most gloriously blue collar job in the world.
It's true. Very well put. Dirk, which Sandman character do you relate to the most?
I like Fiddler's Green, Kevin. I like Fiddler's Green. There's something about the idea of a dream, which is it's not even a person, it's a place, but it dreams it's a person. And it goes and takes advantage of dreams incarceration to go and live a human life of sorts, and becomes this oldie worldy cuddly gentleman, played beautifully by Ray Porter. I don't know, it's incredibly touching. I'd like to be Fiddler's Green. I'd have a nice bit of grass and a couple of nice trees, Governor. Know what I mean? Yeah.
Mr. McAvoy, which Sandman character do you relate to the most?
I think the one that I'd like to be is probably Dest, to be there present for the human experience. The only truly common human experience, I guess. And the one that I probably identify with more, though, and I just see as well, the way that Kat Dennings plays Death is so, so good. There's an inevitability about the way that she speaks that it's just like, yeah, you know, yeah, which is warm and inevitable and final, because you can't see anything after she's just cut you down with, yeah, I know, you're dead. It's so good. Anyway, congrats to her. But the one that I identified most with is probably John Constantine. There's a sort of feeling of ducking and diving in how Neil writes him. I think it's present in the character always anyway, but Neil really gets that across. There's this kind of working class element of somebody in way over their head in a whole world that they never imagined they would be in, and actually managing to float, but only just by the skin of their teeth a lot of the time. And I think that's how I feel a lot in my career. And have done over the last 25 years. So probably John Constantine.
Beautiful answer, man. And you just made a lot of geeks very happy hearing that. I'm sure after all of this, that's the one takeaway item that will sweep the internet. McAvoy goes on for Constantine. I want to thank all of you gentlemen. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to the fans for tuning in. You can download the audiobook at audible.com/The Sandman and use the hashtag The Sandman NYCC to continue the conversation online. Neil, Dirk, James, and James, thank you for the gift that is this audio series, man. It's for somebody who has long loved this book to have it brought to life and to have it be an audio drama first before the requisite filmed version. Allowed the process of imagination to play in a way that it never would if I just sat there and watched a movie. Thank you for still firing my imagination all these decades later.
Thanks, man.
Thank you, Kevin.